The history of education. That's a bit of a unique topic because normally we think of education and history relating to each other more so in the fact that history is a part of our education. But I want to talk about the actual history behind our education models and what we learn and why we've learned them. Now, for the most part, history mainly covers the big, impactful stuff throughout our societies, our governments, our revolutions. Most of them are covering why we do what we do, and most of them are just covering anything that would be considered important or a big deal in a given society or government or country. And that's where education is really a big impactor and a very unique one within history. You see, education has a little bit of a tendency to affect a society or government, and government and societies normally have to affect the education model, and so forth and so forth. And that's why education is considered such a historical topic. It has a long history and it has a long story, and that story can kind of explain where we get our education and where it comes from and why we learn what we learn. Now, I'm going to mainly cover the education models that were mainly in Europe, just simply because those are the ones that spread all over the place and those are the ones that are most particularly used in today's day and age. Also, I don't think this video being spoken English would be very useful to anyone that is in any sort of nation or country that hasn't been affected by the European education model, but that's another story. So, in the history of education, there's always one place that we have to stop and talk about, because while it doesn't affect the whole story, it affects a lot of what we do learn today. Sumer is the first post-Diluvian society, which is to say it's the first society that happened after the Great Flood. The flood with Noah and the animals and the big boats. Now, Sumer society was a bit of an interesting one as one of the first societies that we actually have an historical record. It is also the first society that we historically have an education system on record. But Sumerian education was mostly things that we would consider simplistic. Reading, writing, and they also learned a lot about math. Now, to get a better look into a more unique or specific education system, for that we would move over to Greece. Now, in Greece, that's where education became a really popular and, may I add, significant thing. Greece was a unique country because up until that point, empires had basically ruled the main European territory, and they had also spread beyond the European territory, of course. But Greece always stood out as the ones who beat the Persian Empire, the big empire of the day, but they alone were not their own empire, per se. However, they were a fairly strong country, but that could be found in the secrets of their education. Now, mainly, there were two superpowers in the Greek culture. Now, Greek societies were split up into city-states, which are basically just cities, but they run their government independently. Now, over here, we have Athens, and this is Sparta. But what made Athens truly noteworthy as an educated state was its philosophy and advances in science and theory. Now, during this time frame, the world was still kind of being discovered, so the Athenian education system was largely based on, well, learning and how to learn, and what made it most unique was that during that time frame, those who were learning, or those who were learning from other people, normally had to figure things out on their own a little bit. You didn't have this professor who had been taught things from a guy who had been taught things, who had been taught things, and who learned things throughout history and who knew his stuff very well. You had professors that would come and teach you things that they had just figured out. Or, better yet, you would figure something out, and then you would go teach it. But that's why Athens had such a unique education system. Their education system wasn't based on being taught. It was based on learning, which is what an education system should be, but it kind of isn't anymore. Athens kind of changed the whole continent's education and history. You see, Athens was mainly known for the three philosophers, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, so they're kind of all friends in a way. So they're all linked. But what a lot of people don't know is that Aristotle actually had a pupil of his own. That pupil was known as Alexander the Great. Now, this was a very important thing because this meant that one of the big empires I just mentioned now had a very well-educated leader. And what that meant is that that leader's education could potentially spread throughout an entire continent, which it kind of did. What people don't realize is how that when a person who would go on to conquer an entire continent had a particular education system, that would affect that continent in a very unique way throughout history. Alexander the Great was taught by Aristotle, and he was given a classical education, and he was a big fan of this. He also was very educated in the ways of democracy because Athens was a democratic city-state. So he would go on, and in his conquest, he would spread the classical education system and democracy and all these ideas that he'd been learning from Aristotle, and he spread those out through an entire continent before he kind of died due to fever or something. But it was definitely poison. That was historically accurate, 100%. Anywho, after Alexander's death, he basically left behind this entire big empire, which would, of course, be taken over by other empires and nations and go through its entire midlife crisis with Rome and all that. Of course, the big point of all this is that throughout all that, now the classical education system was put into Europe's big cycle of big nation eat big nation. It very much affected Rome and its ideals because Rome basically copied everything from Greece. But I digress from Rome. Rome really wasn't that important in education. Sorry everyone in Rome. The big point there was that the education system had been spread basically throughout all of Europe. And of course it was carried over to the Americas from England. And for the most part, it was very utilized by the Americans in the construction of their new democracy. For the most part, in today's education system, a lot of things have changed, and there's a lot of history behind each different point and facet behind it. But it's probably more interesting to see where it's going to go, and how it's going to affect us in the future, or how it's going to affect our grandkids, and how we're going to educate them, or if they're going to change the education system. So for now, we're just going to have to wait and see what the world decides to do next, unless we have a time machine. But I'm pretty sure we don't, because if we had a time machine, we'd come back in time and tell everyone that we have a time machine, but we don't. Anyways, that's all the time we have today. Thank you everyone for watching. I'm Silas Hodgson, covering the history of the European education system, and now I have to sign out. Bye-bye.